sets in history that such a world-famous people have walked this area. Thomas Harriot, Matteo, John White, Monadnock, Skyco, and Ralph Lane himself. Sir Francis Drake's fleet and Ralph Lane and company departed the Outer Banks of North Carolina on June 18, 1586. Miraculously, not one incident of serious injury happens to any of the 108 colonists. There were 4 deaths among the 108, but all due to natural causes, as the 4 were described as adventurous of mind, but poor of body. Harriot reported the 4 gentlemen were feeble, weak, and sickly before they left England, and he further indicates they died en route. Apparently Lane did something right. He indicates through special discipline the men kept themselves healthy and apparently on guard at all times. Today, you can gaze across Jimmy Early's sweet corn fields to the river's edge of the Chowan, just off of Swains Mill Road, and realize that those famous names in history stood right there in that early spring of 1586. In Bertie and Hertford County this happened. I can imagine the Pennants under sail on the Chowan, and the light horsemen and the double wherry being pulled along on their oars by men from another time. They saw many of the same things that we can see today. The trees showing off their new light green leaves and the blooms of the dogwood on the shoreline. They couldn't have missed it in the early spring. They saw the amber water in the high cliffs as they rode and sailed along the Bertie County shoreline to the mouth of the Roanoke River. They saw the broadness and tasted the fresh water of Albemarle Sound on their return to Roanoke Island. Well, how can it be that such an important event is not recognized for its content and its conversation? I guess because this part of the dream, a secret base, England's first colony in America, was not going to work due to the treacherous Outer Banks. Further explorers would have to look elsewhere to establish a colony further north to today's Chesapeake Bay. Soon after Lane's departure, June 18, 1586, a long-awaited supply ship arrived at Roanoke Island. Finding no one there, they soon departed. Sir Richard Grenville came still later, and still finding no one on Roanoke, decided to keep an English presence on the island. He put 15 men ashore with provisions to keep the island under English control. Now, the 22nd of July, 1587, is a very important date to us as we try to unravel the mystery of the schooner of the Dismal Swamp. It is this day that Sir Walter Raleigh's final colonization effort begins in mid-America, unfortunately not exactly on purpose. Perhaps you're not too familiar with the historic accounts previously noted, but if you're from eastern North Carolina or have visited the Outer Banks of North Carolina sometime since 1938, then you've heard about Raleigh's last attempt at colonization. Looking back a bit, Amadas and Barlow first explored the Outer Banks for Raleigh in 1584. Then the next year, 1585, Ralph Lane, along with his company, including Thomas Harriot and John White, among others, lived on Roanoke Island for almost a year before they were taken off in 1586. Also, 3 men of Lane's company were left to fend for themselves in 1586. Then 15 men are placed on Roanoke Island as a holding force until 1587. To get to July 22nd, 1587, we'll have to turn back time again till April of that year. Preparations were made for the 1587 colony. 3 ships were prepared to make the long journey. The ships involved were the Lion, the largest, and considered the admiral of the fleet. The admiral designated that it was in lead of the company. Today we call the lead ship in a group a flagship. The purpose was the same, with the admiral usually in the lead, followed by, in this case, a flyboat, a smaller craft of Dutch origin. The flyboat, which designates the design of the ship in this case and not its name, probably had 3 masts and was rather swift in the water. It was probably what was called a prize, which means it was captured during a previous voyage by some of Raleigh's men and put to their own use. and the third ship in the group was a pinnace. At this point, and for the rest of this adventure, we will by conjecture call her Dorothie. It's really important that you remember her name. At this point in the voyage of 1587, the three ships departed finally the port of Plymouth, England, May the 8th, for America and the area called Virginia, or you might say the Outer Banks of modern North Carolina and the Chesapeake Bay to the north. Why I say finally, the voyage actually began with a departure from Portsmouth, England on the 26th of April. Apparently and logically, the ships were first outfitted in Portsmouth, and outfitting, including loading 117 men, women, and boys, was completed at Plymouth. In between, there was a stoppage for 8 days at the port of Cowes, England. The stop at Cowes is conjectured by Quinn to include conversations with Sir George Carey, who was later to supply the colony after its arrival in America. However, this mission by Carey failed to work out. The final stop at Plymouth, according to another conjecture by Quinn, was to converse with Sir Walter Raleigh and receive final instructions. Now, keep in mind that we are dealing with sailing ships of 400 years ago. I can imagine that you would never say, "We'll depart at 7:15 on Friday the 8th. If there was no wind or the winds were contrary, nobody went anywhere. In all of the accounts I've read, I've never seen a cut-in-stone date published that actually worked out. They were always at the mercy of the weather, and often arrived at their destination a few days or even months after their original schedule. On this end, eastern North Carolina seems like every time a big maneuver of ships or a planned sailing was either hampered by a hurricane or a northeast condition. Looking back at Drake's departure with Lane and company, the entire scenario was apparently under the influence of a hurricane. So we have our three ships underway for the New World. If you're not too familiar with the sea, you'll think that these ships are on some type of a world tour. They depart England, sail past the coast of Spain and Portugal to the Azores, then on to the Caribbean, past Puerto Rico, then north of Cuba, and finally head north along the Florida coast. What's happening is this: they're using the prevailing winds and the ocean currents to move them along. When they begin to coast Florida, they're on the Gulf Stream, which powers them northward to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. When they reach 35 degrees latitude, they turn left, which will bring them to Port Fernando. Port Fernando, at the time, 1587, was an inlet through the Outer Banks. Port Fernando is named after its discoverer, Simon Fernando. It actually was not a port, as you would think of one, but just an inlet that provided a straight shot to Roanoke Island from the south. During the 1587 voyage, it just so happens that Simon Fernando is the master of the Admiral the Lion, and is at the root of the 1587 colony's troubles to come. This inlet has since closed and is marked today by a highway marker. All the ships that had arrived would drop anchor offshore, but within sight of land. Even in 1587, ship captains were well aware of the hazards of the many shoals in this area. This gives us one of the reasons why Raleigh had decided that the colony should be established on Chesapeake Bay, the 1587 colony's intended destination. Let me point out, at this place in our story, the whole voyage contained a few stops at islands along the way for supplies, and to give the potential colonists a break to stretch their legs. The entire voyage, from Plymouth to Port Fernando, took about 10 weeks to complete. Sometimes this long way around to take advantage of the wind and currents took a little less time, and sometimes a little more time. But usually you could count on 2 months one way as a good round number. Life was difficult on the ships. Day in and day out, more sun, wind, and weather. Upon entering the Caribbean, stops were made to trade for supplies, but mostly in search of fresh water. One stop along the way, White describes, the Caicos Islands. The colonists went ashore, went hunting, successfully bringing in a quantity of swans. 2, Simon Fernando spent the day with an unknown companion from the ship. It's important to note that Fernando's companion was from the ship the Lion, on which he was commander, meaning at least one of the females was on the Lion. Quinn conjectures it was one of the female colonists, as he and his companion went to one part of the island and the hunters went to another. Please keep in mind this particular stop. It was the 6th of July, according to White's narrative, and as it is in eastern North Carolina, it was in the midst of the mosquito season. Let me point out, all during this 1587 voyage, John White has nothing positive to say about Simon Fernando. At every point, if something goes wrong, he blames it on Fernando. Apparently, the two men do not get along. After leaving the Caicos group of islands early the next morning, the next stop is off the coast of present-day North Carolina in the vicinity of Wilmington, where, according to White, Fernando has mistakenly taken the area as being near Roanoke Island. This obviously not being the case, they pull away again and head further north, where en route, White accuses Fernando of almost wrecking the ship, the Lion, by running it aground. However, White praises Captain Stafford for saving the day. This also indicates that the Dorothie was in the lead, as Stafford is the captain of the Dorothie and detected the shallow water ahead and sent out a warning to the Lion as it trailed behind. Running a ship aground on the Outer Banks, or anywhere for that matter, would be so serious it could not be taken lightly. The whole ordeal could have ended at that moment with a great loss of life, and the colonists' lifeline back to England wrecked as well. It was thought by White and the colonists that the flyboat was already lost off the coast of Portugal, as she had not been seen for many weeks. If the Lion had run aground on the shoals, then the Penance would be the last-ditch effort to escape tragedy. But due to her size, she would never been able to handle all of the people from the Lion, plus her own company. If this had happened, she too would most likely be wrecked on a shoal as well, trying to make an inlet and carry the people to safety. July 22nd, 1587. The two ships drop anchor at Port Fernando. John White leaves the Lion and goes aboard the Penance, the Dorothie. He's accompanied by 40 of his best men. Upon completing the transfer, Fernando, through one of his men, sends word that only White and a few others would be allowed back on the Lion, and the remainder left on Roanoke Island. As you might notice, at this point, Fernando is retaliating against all the things that White has said about him. It appears that Fernando is fed up with John White, and now will get even. Fernando probably despises White so much that he will not even face him with the order, and does it through a crew member. White and company arrive from the inlet on the Dorothie at sunset on Roanoke Island, July 22nd, 1587, and immediately look for the 15 men that were left by Granville in 1586, and they are not found. At this point, we must explore using logic as to who was on what ship. The flyboat is assumed lost and has been for almost 2 months, White thinks. The flyboat is either captured by Spaniards or sunk in a storm when it was separated from the fleet, according to White, in the Bay of Portugal. Logically speaking, the women are all on the Lion, as are all the colonists, because one of them is White's daughter, Eleanor Dare. If White's daughter had been left anywhere on the flyboat, you can only assume that he would have written many pages of complaints against Fernando. Instead, White only notes that the flyboat has been left by Fernando and abandoned. In pursuit of Dorothie. In the mid